Alright, me. It's a little bit later in the same day that I finished reading the last one. But I just finished reading Excerpts from a Book I'll Never Write by Nadia Starbinski. This was self-published in 2017, I do believe that's the year. It's a very good collection of ideas, right, coming from Starbinski. Yes, Kat, hello. I'm glad you decided to show up right when I started doing this. Certainly, I think they resonated with me more when I was 17, 18, 19 than right now, right? In the same way that a lot of my own personal writings, resonate a lot more with how I was feeling at that point in time rather than now being able to look back and reflect on them. It is not this super complex story of poetry and narrative poetry and things of that nature, right? It is simplistic in a lot of ways, right? Which I would argue for what this book is doing is good for it, right? One of the things that comes to poetry, right, and the way that we look at poetry and the way that we produce it and things like that, right? When we look at published poetry, we tend to think of poems as this, they need to be this great, masterful, wonderful thing, but then when we write it, we expect it to be this very personal thing, right? And Starbinski, I think, strikes a nice middle here, right, where there's nothing that's like incredibly complex, right, but there's an intimacy that exists within the writing that is really fantastic, right? It also gives this concept of like a narrative style of piece when they are more than likely, right, not knowing Starbinski, but they're more than likely, as the title implies, small excerpts from different pieces and whatnot, right? And combined, they can create a cohesive story about love and then falling out of love and then accepting and then, being able to grow and move on, right? It's a wave of thoughts, right, rather than a cohesive narrative poetry structure, which I think is really interesting, right? Because when we look at poetry collections, it tends to fall into two categories, right? It's either a collection, right, which is like we internalize that each poem is its own separate idea, or we think of it as these are all things that are about the same thing, right? Or like it's one big long narrative piece. And this Excerpts from a Book I'll Never Write really kind of falls into all three of them, right? It's not leaning in one more so than the other, right? It falls pretty equally into all three of these categories, which I think is really, really interesting. Personally, poetry books and like kind of these narrative type pieces are really the only ones that I kind of mark up, and I just do it by bending the pages because I'm an animal and I'm terrible. Yeah. All of these marks are things that at some point meant something to me when I first read it, or one of the first few times that I read it. I believe this was one of the books I brought with me to college. When I was going to Colorado State, I think I brought two poetry books. I think I brought this, and I think I brought another piece. I don't remember the name of it, but it's two different poetry collections combined into one. But yeah, right. In a lot of ways, this collection still speaks to me in a lot, right? Especially looking at certain sections of this. The section 2, which is loss, and section 3, which is acceptance, right? Because a lot of it deals with especially the acceptance portion, deals with the inherent self-destruction of acceptance, right? Because either in accepting that things have changed and things are different than they once were, right, is that either we have to look at ourselves and chisel away the things that were once another person's, right? Because that's the thing with love and relationships, whether or not they are romantic or they're platonic, right? It's a thing of where your relationships form who you end up being, right? And you take little tidbits of everyone, whether or not you're really self-conscious of it. And when those relationships no longer exist, you are now faced with this thing of what do I get rid of? What is destroyed? Because doing these little things reminds me of this person, right? And so you either go through self-destruction in the way that like you have to analyze what you do and like decide what is and what is not worth keeping, or the self-destruction of the way that we normally think of it as like the depressive state of acceptance and moving on and that sort. So that's that. It's a good collection, right? I don't even know if you can still buy this, because it was independently published, so I have no idea if you can still even buy this, but that's that. That's excerpts from a book I'll never read, or excerpts from a book I'll never write. Yeah.